February 24th, 1945. Oberleutnant Franz Stigler sat in the cockpit of his Messerschmitt Bf 109, hands trembling slightly as he pulled his leather gloves tighter. The morning air above Brandenburg was crystal clear, the kind of visibility that fighter pilots dream about. Below him, the German countryside stretched in patches of white snow and dark forest. Above him, contrails were already beginning to streak the sky. American contrails, hundreds of them. He checked his ammunition counter. 120 rounds remaining for his 20mm cannon. Perhaps 300 rounds for his machine guns. These numbers had once seemed adequate. Today they felt like bringing a pistol to an artillery duel. Stigler had been flying combat missions since 1940. He had flown in the Battle of Britain, over North Africa, over Sicily, over the Eastern Front. He had shot down 28 Allied aircraft. He wore the Knight's Cross at his throat. He was one of the Luftwaffe's experienced survivors, part of a shrinking fraternity of pilots who had seen the entire arc of the war from the air. And on this crystalline morning, he was about to witness something that would shatter everything he had been told about German air superiority, about the Luftwaffe's quality advantage, about fighting spirit overcoming material disadvantage. He was about to watch 450 German fighters evaporate against 2,800 American P-51s. If we stop remembering their sacrifice, it's as if they died twice. Please subscribe to this channel so their stories are never forgotten. The radio crackled. Formation orders. Stigler's Grupp was vectoring toward an incoming American bomber stream. Intelligence reported approximately 1,000 B-17 and B-24 heavy bombers approaching from the west, targeting Berlin and nearby industrial centers. The bombers themselves were not the immediate problem. German flak could handle bombers. The problem was their escort. The Americans had finally solved the range problem that had protected German cities for the first 3 years of the war. They had built a fighter that could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The P-51 Mustang. Stigler had encountered Mustangs before. Everyone had by early 1945. The pilots talked about them in the ready rooms, voices low, sharing information that contradicted everything the propaganda ministry said. The Mustang was faster than the 109 at most altitudes. It could outturn the 109 in a sustained fight. It had twice the range. And most critically, the Americans had built them in numbers that seemed impossible. German intelligence estimated American fighter strength over Germany at between 2,000 and 3,000 aircraft on any given day. The entire Luftwaffe fighter force in the West, stretched across all of Germany, numbered perhaps 800 operational aircraft. And operational was a generous term. Many fighters sat grounded for lack of fuel. Others lacked spare parts. Some had pilots so inexperienced they had fewer than 20 hours of flight time. Stigler's formation climbed through 15,000 feet. 18 aircraft, mostly 109s with a few Focke-Wulf 190DS mixed in. This was what the Luftwaffe called a Grupp, a group roughly equivalent to an Allied squadron. In 1940, a Grupp had numbered 40 aircraft or more. In 1945, 18 was optimistic. At 22,000 feet, Stigler spotted the first American formation. His breath caught. Bombers stretched from horizon to horizon in neat combat boxes, stacked in altitude, their contrails painting the sky white. He had seen large bomber formations before. He had attacked formations of 200, even 300 bombers. But this was different. This was industrial. This was a sky filled with aluminum. And around the bombers, above them, beside them, below them, weaving in constant protective patterns were the Mustangs. Hundreds of them. They flew in loose formations, pairs and flights, spread across the sky in a defensive screen that covered the entire bomber stream. Stigler had never seen so many enemy fighters in one place. His tactical mind tried to calculate ratios and realized the mathematics were hopeless. The Grupp commander's voice came through the radio, tight with tension barely masked by professional calm. They would attempt to break through the fighter screen and engage the bombers. Standard tactics: climb above the formation, dive at high speed through the escorts, make one firing pass at the bombers, then dive away and escape before the escorts could react. It was a tactic that had worked in 1943. It had become difficult in 1944. In February 1945, it was nearly suicidal. Stigler pushed his throttle forward and began his climb. The Daimler-Benz engine responded smoothly. At least his aircraft was in good mechanical condition. Many were not. He had heard stories of fighters suffering engine failures on takeoff, of wings falling off during high-G maneuvers because replacement parts were made from substandard materials, of guns jamming after the first burst because ammunition quality had deteriorated. At 28,000 feet, the Grupp leveled off and turned toward the bomber stream. Stigler could see individual aircraft now. P-51s, the famous flying fortress. They flew in tight defensive boxes, each bomber positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire for its neighbors. The formation was designed to create a zone of defensive fire so dense that attacking fighters would be shredded before reaching firing position. And surrounding that already formidable defense were the Mustangs. They had spotted the German formation. Stigler watched as elements of the escort screen began vectoring toward them. The Americans did not rush. They did not break formation. They maneuvered with practiced coordination, multiple flights converging from different angles to cut off the German approach. The Grupp commander gave the order to attack. Stigler pushed his stick forward and dove. The 109 accelerated rapidly, its engine screaming as air speed built. 600 kilometers per hour. 700. At this speed, the aircraft handled like a truck, sluggish and heavy. But speed was life. Speed was the only advantage a 109 still had against a Mustang. The first Mustangs flashed past, rolling to follow the diving Germans. Stigler ignored them. The tactic depended on speed. Dive through, shoot, escape before the escorts could match your dive and line up shots. He selected a B-17 in the formation's leading edge and centered his gun sight. Range closed rapidly. 1,200 meters. 1,000. 800. Tracers arced past his canopy. Someone was shooting at him. He could not see who. The sky had become chaos. Germans diving, Americans turning, bombers holding formation, everyone maneuvering in the same compressed volume of air. At 600 meters, Stigler opened fire. His cannon thumped, its recoil shuddering through the airframe. He walked his tracers across the bomber's right wing. He saw strikes sparkling on the wing surface. Then he was through, flashing past the bomber formation, pulling out of his dive, the G-forces crushing him into his seat. He glanced back. The B-17 he had hit was still flying, still in formation. His burst had not been long enough, had not concentrated enough hits. Failed attack. Behind him, the sky was full of turning fighters. The Mustangs had followed the German dive and now held every advantage. They were fresher, faster in level flight, more numerous, and positioned above the scattering German formation. Stigler saw a 109 explode in midair, hit by a sustained burst that detonated its ammunition. Another 109 was trailing smoke, diving steeply, its pilot probably dead or unconscious. A third was being chased by two Mustangs, turning desperately, losing altitude with each defensive break. The entire engagement had lasted perhaps 90 seconds. The Grupp was already combat ineffective. Stigler pushed his throttle to emergency power and dove for the deck. It was the only escape. The 109 could dive faster than the Mustang, at least initially. If he could reach low altitude and find cloud cover or terrain to hide in, he might survive. His altimeter unwound rapidly. 20,000 feet. 15,000. 10,000. A Mustang was following him, matching his dive, closing the range. Stigler broke hard left, then right, jinking randomly to spoil the American's aim. Tracers streamed past his canopy. The Mustang pilot was good, compensating for Stigler's maneuvers, walking his fire closer. At 4,000 feet, Stigler spotted salvation. A cloud bank, low and thick, covering the landscape ahead. He dove straight into it, the gray murk swallowing his aircraft. He pulled back on the stick, leveling off blind, flying on instruments, hoping the Mustang pilot would not follow him into the cloud where a collision was entirely possible. After 30 seconds that felt like 30 minutes, he broke out below the cloud layer. Empty sky. He had escaped. He stayed low, hedge-hopping across the German countryside, following valleys and treelines, making himself as difficult a target as possible if any American fighters were still hunting. 30 minutes later, he landed at his base. The field was quiet. No victory celebrations. No pilots gathering to share combat stories. The other aircraft trickled in slowly. Stigler counted them as they landed. 7. 7 out of 18. 11 aircraft lost. 11 pilots dead or missing. Over 60% casualties in a single engagement that had achieved nothing. They had not shot down a single bomber. They had claimed perhaps 3 or 4 Mustangs, though even those claims seemed optimistic. In the operations room, the intelligence officer recorded their reports with a face that showed nothing. This was not unusual anymore. This was Tuesday. The Luftwaffe was losing 50, 60, sometimes 80 pilots per day over Germany. The training schools could not replace them. The factories could not build aircraft fast enough. The fuel reserves were nearly exhausted. And the Americans kept coming, wave after wave, 1,000-bomber raids escorted by clouds of Mustangs. Stigler sat in the corner of the ready room and tried to process what he had seen. 450 German fighters had been scrambled that morning across the entire defensive zone. Intelligence would later confirm that figure. 450 aircraft, representing nearly every operational fighter the Luftwaffe could put in the air that day. Against them, the Americans had deployed 2,800 fighters. Not bombers. Fighters. Just the escorts. The ratio was 6-to-1. And that ratio assumed all 450 German aircraft reached combat. In reality, many had turned back with mechanical failures. Others had been bounced before reaching the bombers. Others had expended their ammunition in brief, futile engagements and withdrawn. The effective ratio had been even worse. Stigler had been told since flight school that German pilots were superior, better trained, more aggressive, more skilled, quality over quantity. One German pilot was worth 3 Allied pilots. These had been articles of faith, repeated so often they became accepted truth. He had believed them in 1940 when he shot down hurricanes over the Channel. He had believed them in 1942 when he fought Spitfires over North Africa. By 1944, doubt had crept in. By February 1945, the truth was undeniable. The quality gap had never been as large as propaganda claimed. And now there was no quality gap at all. American pilots flying P-51s in early 1945 were veterans with hundreds of combat hours. They flew superior aircraft. They had unlimited fuel and ammunition. They outnumbered German defenders by ratios that made combat a mathematical certainty rather than a test of skill. One German pilot might still be equal to one American pilot. But one German pilot was not equal to 6 American pilots attacking simultaneously from different angles. The Luftwaffe was not being outfought. It was being arithmetically eliminated. Over the following weeks, Stigler continued flying missions. The pattern repeated with minor variations. German fighters would scramble. They would engage vastly superior American formations. They would suffer catastrophic casualties. They would achieve minimal results. The mathematics ground on inexorable and uncaring. By March, fuel shortages became critical. Missions were canceled not because pilots were unavailable or aircraft were broken, but because there was no fuel to put in the tanks. By April, the shortages extended to ammunition, to spare parts, to everything. The Luftwaffe was collapsing not from lack of courage but from lack of resources. The pilots kept flying because they had been ordered to fly. They kept fighting because surrender was not permitted. And they kept dying because the situation they faced was tactically impossible. On April 20th, Stigler flew his last combat mission. He engaged a formation of P-51s over what remained of Berlin, fired his remaining ammunition without scoring hits, and landed at a base that was being evacuated ahead of Soviet ground forces. The war was ending. Everyone knew it. The only question was how many more would die before the inevitable became official. Stigler survived. Many did not. Of the approximately 105,000 Luftwaffe personnel killed during the war, a disproportionate number died in the final year, sacrificed in a defensive campaign that German leadership knew was hopeless but refused to abandon. They died not in pursuit of victory, which was no longer possible, but in service to orders that demanded resistance regardless of cost. The story of 450 Bf-109s evaporating against 2,800 P-51s is not a story about cowardice or failure of will. It is a story about arithmetic, about industrial capacity, about what happens when a military force, regardless of its skill or determination, faces an opponent with overwhelming material superiority. The Luftwaffe pilots who flew in early 1945 were not less capable than those who had won victories in 1940. But capability became irrelevant when outnumbered 6-1 by equally capable opponents flying superior aircraft. Franz Stigler spent the decades after the war rarely speaking of his experiences. When he did, usually to other veterans, his tone was factual, clinical, drained of the emotion that had filled those final months. He described what he had seen. He did not justify it or condemn it. He simply remembered. In 1990, Stigler met Charles Brown, an American B-17 pilot whose damaged bomber Stigler had encountered over Germany in December 1943. Instead of shooting down the crippled bomber, Stigler had escorted it to the coast, ensuring it escaped. The two men became close friends, their shared experience creating a bond that transcended their former enmity. When interviewers asked Stigler why he had spared Brown's bomber, his answer was simple. He had seen enough killing. He had understood, even then in 1943, that the war was lost. Shooting one more bomber would not change that. It would simply add more names to the casualty lists. By early 1945, that understanding had become universal among Luftwaffe pilots. They flew because they were ordered to fly. They fought because they were ordered to fight. But they knew, with certainty that grew more absolute with each mission, that their sacrifice would not alter the outcome. The mathematics had already determined the result. Thank you for watching. Most of them received no medals, no monuments, only stories left behind. If this touched your heart, please subscribe so they will not be forgotten.